Hello there, good evening. The House of Commons is back after not sitting over the summer months for its summer break. Today, a look at the government's new affordability measures unveiled on this first day back to Parliament. For more on that, Associate Minister of Finance Randy Boissonnault is coming up, where he will lay out and discuss some of those affordability measures outlined by the government today and what that means for you. Also coming up, what are the priorities of the government versus the opposition for the fall sitting of Parliament? What should those priorities be? MPs will be here to debate that. Also,
which is costing families over $2,000 in extra costs, and that does not include the increased interest rate prices that people are paying on their mortgages. In fact, this is on gas, groceries, and heat. Why won't they cancel these tax hikes so that Canadians can keep a roof over their heads?
Talk about the fact that he's talking about EI and CPP, things that are important for people who've lost their jobs or for seniors when they're planning for retirement. But
it's Pierre Poilievre's first question period as the Conservative leader. What can we make of how he approached it and what is to come in the coming weeks with a Poilievre-led Conservative Party? Party observers are here to discuss that and more coming up. The return of the House is something that many political watchers have been waiting for. Obviously, there's lots of things that are happening and taking place in the House of Commons. The Conservative Party has a new leader, but as it relates to the government's priorities, today they released some new affordability measures in order to help Canadians afford the rising cost of living. And joining me now to discuss that and more is Associate Finance Minister Randy Boissonnault. Minister, thanks so much for your time. Let's start out. The rising cost of living, inflation is down now to 7%, which many Canadians would still hear that number and see it as higher than they would obviously like it to be, but it is much lower than months that have passed and have gone by in the past couple of months over the last year or so. What can Canadians expect from your government's new affordability measures unveiled today?
Well, Wyatt, thanks for the question and for the opportunity to be with you here today. Look, 7% is still higher than I want to see it, and it's higher than our government wants to see it. And that's why the Bank of Canada has the mandate to bring inflation down to 2% and below. And no country in the world right now has inflation at 2% or lower. So today, you're right, we introduced two new bills, and they are designed to reduce the cost of living. And so essentially it breaks into three pieces. One is a $500 top up to the Canada housing dividend. And there's also a doubling of the GST tax credit, which is really important. It's a very targeted measure to those Canadians who need it the most. And then there is also the Canada Dental plan that we have been working on for some time, and which will put real money in the pockets of real Canadians and make sure that families that are making $90,000 and less, that have children who are 12 years and younger, will be able to access $1,300 over the next 2 years. So that's just today. And if you go and look back at what we put in the budget and what we've been doing with reducing the fees of childcare, there's a lot on the table to make sure that Canadians have the money they need to make ends meet and to withstand this period of high inflation.
And you mentioned the dental aspect of things, also doubling the GST credit, also something that is going to obviously make an impact in the lives of everyday Canadians. But when you look at what other people are calling for, when you look specifically at the opposition parties in the House of Commons, you have the Conservatives who are largely blaming the economic and fiscal situation on the Bank of Canada. And then you have the NDP who is saying that your government is allowing big companies to profit too much. How do you balance those two perspectives, and how will your government ultimately ensure that the financial policy and the economic policy that is being put forward is ultimately a plan that will help Canadians to move forward?
Well, it's a great question. And our plan, I think if you can describe it in its most simplest way, is we're taking targeted supports for the people who need it the most at the time when they need it the most, and making really sure that we're targeting the measures to those people who probably don't have any savings to draw on during this time of inflation. And the reason we're doing that is we're taking really good care with the economy so that we're not adding any fuel to inflation. And there's a whole bunch of economists, Trevor Toomby out of Alberta, Lindsay Tedds at the University of Calgary, also the former Deputy Parliamentary Budget Officer, Mustafa Askari, all have said very clearly that these targeted supports will not increase inflation. When it comes to having companies that are doing well, our government in the last budget, in the 22 budget, made it clear that we were increasing the tax rate on banks and insurance companies, the most profitable of those. And we also put in a one-time 15% tax on profits of over $1 billion. So Wyatt, our job is a balancing act. We want to support those Canadians who have the greatest need at this time of greatest need. And we also want to make sure that we're not, doing too many supports that could then increase inflation.
And also on your government supply and confidence deal with the NDP, that is largely seen as something that will help to get economic things done, financial things done, and to meet the financial needs of Canadians. The NDP has came out recently and has talked about if the needs of and the needs that they set out when this agreement had been signed were not met, that they would be prepared to at least try to make some adjustments or pull out of that deal. I guess, what do you make of that? But more specifically, how will your government work with the other parties in the House of Commons and work with, financial stakeholders in the industry to help to address the rising cost of living?
So again, it's a really good question. And we have a minority government, and the supply and confidence agreement that we have with the New Democrats is exactly that. And it's to provide our government with the ability to implement 4 budgets, which would take us to a 2025 election cycle. But this is why, the conversations that we have, the oversight committee of the agreement is really important. And, one of the key pieces in that agreement was making sure that we demonstrated a commitment to dental care and for families. And that's why in this first phase of that program, we're targeting dental supports to families that make less than $90,000 a year, and focusing on those kids that, in many cases may never have gone to the dentist before. I mean, I want kids to have healthy teeth. I want them to grow into healthy adults, and having good, dental care is a key piece of that. And we're talking about some serious money. We're talking about $1,300 per child per year over the next 2 years to make sure that those children can have access to dental support. So I guess the other part of the question is, if you take a look at all of our supports, when you go to making sure that the Canada Child Benefit rises with the cost of inflation, when you take a look at the amount that people are saving on their childcare fees, thousands of dollars across the country now, all of these things add up to contributing to making life more affordable during this inflationary period.
And when you look at the rising cost of housing, obviously an issue that is something that is being felt and addressed by many Canadians. The Cost of Living Relief Act, something that was mentioned today in the press release, would enact 2 important measures, including one which was a one-time top-up to the Canada Housing Benefit. Now, I know that would largely fall under the responsibility of Minister Hussein, but obviously housing in general largely contributes to the rising cost of living and is something that many first-time home buyers are feeling now. Obviously, the I guess, strain on the housing market. What are you as a government doing to ensure that Canadians are able to afford a place to call home?
So there's a couple of things I'd say on this, Wyatt. First, we got to build more houses. That's why our plan in the election and in Budget 22 is to double the amount of housing we're going to see the government be responsible for building over the next 5 years. This is all part of tens and tens of billions of dollars in the National Housing Program. Rapid Housing Accelerator, what does that mean? It means we take either, like in my riding, there's 5 examples of like old parking lots or old land that was never used. And within 12 months, there is a building and it's going to house dozens of people who need the housing. And literally that's within 12 months, we see new housing coming on stream. So we've got some bigger cities that need to do a better job of cutting through the red tape and getting to the point where we as a federal government can work with them to get the housing built. But today is an example of, we've got a really good $2,500 Canada Housing Benefit in place, and we're adding $500 to that. Now, some people, can say, how does that help? Well, at the end of the month, $500 is really going to help the family that gets that money. So housing is a complex issue, but we have a a solution that has many different aspects to it. And that's what it's going to take to house Canadians. And as we see a growing economy, we need to make sure that housing's in place, that we got labor, workers, and that we also make sure that our infrastructure and everything's in place so that we can have a growing economy and not growing inflation.
And with the growing inflation piece that you just mentioned there, how do you ensure that the rising and the annual inflation rates that come out, or the monthly inflation rates that come out from Statistics Canada, how can you ensure that that number goes down rather than up?
So that's the job of the Bank of Canada. And that's the 5-year mandate that we renewed with the Bank of Canada to make sure that they would focus on getting inflation down to 2% or less. And as I said earlier, there's no country in the world right now that is at 2% or less. And so that is the job of the Bank of Canada. Our job on the fiscal side of the house is to make sure that we're making life more affordable for Canadians. So that's why, several $100s a month in people's pockets, making sure that they have thousands of dollars a year in savings and childcare, and also, telling the story of the fact that we have a good economy right now. We have the fastest growing economy in the G7. It will be the same for next year. We have the lowest deficit of any G7 country, and this is a demonstration of the investments that we made in Canadians during the pandemic, big investments, so that we could get to this point outside of the acute phase of COVID where the economy is doing well. We have low unemployment, and we're going to keep building an economy that works for all Canadians.
And just before you go, just lastly, we hear a lot from various financial stakeholders and even from your government yourself about the idea of obviously inflation and the rising cost of living, not just happening here in Canada, but happening around the world. What role do you see, working with various other stakeholders, including other countries in this case, to address the rising cost of living, especially on, the goods that Canada imports and exports?
This is a really great question. So there's 3 big reasons why we're facing inflation around the world. You put your finger on it in the end of your question, which is snarled supply chains coming out of COVID. There's a whole bunch of supply chains around the world that still haven't been, fully opened up since the pandemic, the acute phase of the pandemic ended. China's zero COVID policy has also caused a number of the world's largest ports to be closed for extended periods of time. That is also not helpful. And then the illegal war of Russia against Ukraine, that is also causing a spike in food prices, a spike in energy prices. And so all of these things are important underlying elements. So what do we need to do? We need to keep supporting Ukraine. We need to keep dialogue open with China. And we need to make sure that in our own jurisdiction and with our trading partners, that we're creating and opening up supply chains for the free flowing movement of people and goods. And those are things that we're working on every day.
Okay, Associate Finance Minister Randy Boissonnault, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your time tonight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. All the best.
Thank you. Francesco Sorbera is a Liberal MP for the Ontario riding of Vaughan Woodbridge, and Garnet Jennis is a Conservative MP for the Alberta riding of Forward Park, Fort Saskatchewan. Hello to you both. Thank you for making the time. Francesco, I'll start out with you. The return of the House of Commons today, a lot of people looking at the steps your government has taken as it relates to some of its commitments and promises that it made, even as recent as the last federal budget or as the last federal election campaign. How confident are you that your government will be able to commit to completing some of those tasks, such as, for example, childcare, something we hear a lot about, but perhaps committing to lowering the cost of housing, et cetera, within the next couple of months so that Canadians can see some relief, you could say, to some of the most challenging issues that they're currently facing?
Thank you, Wyatt, and thank you for the invitation to kindly join you this evening on the panel. It's always a pleasure to be here. It's great to be back in Parliament, and today, the first official day of the session. It's just wonderful to see MPs from all parties and catch up and talk about how they're doing and how their summers were spent, and obviously delve right into the issues of the day. And we know, and I fully understand after being home for the summer of my riding, obviously the rising cost of living, the affordability issues that have impacted not only all Canadians, but globally. And what I can say is, we've started off this session in Parliament with legislation. First off, with fulfilling a key promise that we made on dental care. We're bringing that legislation forward to begin with, helping families with children under 12 cover the dental costs. It's means tested against the family income. Obviously, dealing with the affordability side even further, the issue of doubling the GST, HST for a period of time, benefit 12 million families, individuals in Canada, and then providing a $500 supplement for renters. So just a number of affordability measures. I'm happy to report the childcare, that national childcare is coming to fruition. We've signed agreements with all provinces. So we're working on the priorities that I know are held deeply by the residents of my riding. And you know what? I'm just so glad. I'll send it off this, turn over to yourself and back to Garnet as well. Just glad to be back and debating the issues and debating policy, because that is what a healthy democracy requires. And it's just good back. It's good to be back and seeing my colleagues from all sides of the aisle. And as we continue to build this great country, we're blessed to call home.
And Garnet, what do you make of, first of all, some of the new affordability measures that were announced today? Some changes to dental care, as well as some GST changes. What do you make of that? But also, I guess, what do you make of the fact that you now obviously have a new leader? How might it change as to what your party would like to see in terms of an economic and fiscal standpoint from your previous leader to now your current leader?
Well, thank you. And it's interesting hearing Francesco talk about what now he says the government is focused on, because our leader, before he was elected leader as finance critic and in various roles, has just been laser focused on inflation and on how inflation is making life more expensive and less affordable for Canadians. At the time when he was first sounding the alarm about how the government's policies were driving inflation, the finance minister, still the finance minister, was saying actually we should be thinking about deflation and how the circumstances were causing deflation. And without any acknowledgement of how wrong the government was, now they're trying to change their tune. It's amazing the results that Pierre Poilievre has achieved already. Even as Parliament is beginning, the government is now talking about, or at least pretending to be engaged with the issue that he'd been talking about for years. And the government is also talking about reversing their silly, ineffective travel rules, some things that he and others had been pushing on. So his leadership is already forcing the government back onto their heels. But in terms of the specific measures the government has put forward, look, it's clear that Liberals plan to raise taxes. They're talking about higher taxes, automatic tax increases to the carbon tax and to payroll taxes. And I don't think tax increases are going to make life more affordable for Canadians. And that's why Conservatives have been pushing the Liberals to reverse their planned tax increases. It's all well and good to say, well, okay, we're gonna increase government spending. But their approach of higher taxes, higher spending has been what has driven inflation all along. It's not the solution to inflation; it's the cause of the problem.
Joining me now are political observers Kim Wright, Andrew Perez, and Janet Silver. Hello to you all. Thanks for making the time. Janet, let me begin with you. The return of the House today, obviously something that many people have been waiting for in order for the government to be able to address some of the important issues facing Canadians and for the opposition to be able to ask questions to the government on some of those important issues. What do you make of how the first day in the House of Commons back unfolded?
Just as you said, Wyatt, it was as expected. Pierre Poilievre, first couple of questions, all about affordability. Unfortunately, due to other scheduling conflicts, the Prime Minister was not in question period today. He's in New York at the United Nations General Assembly meetings. Neither was the Deputy Prime Minister. So to take the first couple of questions was the Tourism Minister, Randy Boissonnault. But yes, it was as expected. Affordability, the Conservatives charging that, prices that the government is allowing, all these tax hikes rather, that they're not doing enough to help average Canadians, that inflation, it's all the fault of the Liberals. And of course, the Liberals then stand up and say, here's what we've done in terms of childcare. Inflation has come down a bit. Here's other things that we've done. They introduced today, of course, a couple of bills with regards to providing dental care, rent relief for low-income Canadians, and a GST rebate. But of course, the Conservatives were not having any of that.
Kim, what do you make of some of those new measures proposed today, as Janet alluded to, some dental aspects of things, some GST changes, et cetera? What do you make of that, and what do you think that says about how the government will approach the fall session of Parliament?
Well, thank goodness for Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats, because without that confidence and supply motion, those legislative pieces would have been press releases that we might have gotten to at some point in creation. But Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats said, you're going to have these done, and you're going to have them done by Christmas, or we're out, walking away from this deal. And you know, when you say put up or shut up and you give that ultimatum, the prime minister said, all right, fine, I guess we got to do this. So good for Canadians. And frankly, it is what Canadians set parliamentarians back for back-to-back minority parliaments, not for, you know, fighting in the sandbox, but how do we actually get things done that matter to people? And as we go into an economic downturn, things like dental care, childcare, you know, we all talked about the SHE session. These are important things to make sure that Canadians have access to services in a way that is affordable and that is meaningful to them, and not more just tax cuts and things that won't actually impact people's lives in a meaningful way right off the bat. So thank goodness for Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats. And everything else, it's the usual political theater. The opposition proposes something, the government says no, the government proposed something, the opposition says no. So thank goodness Jagmeet's the grown-up in the room.
Andrew, what do you make of how the opposition, with Pierre Poilievre as his first day in question period in the House of Commons as the leader of what is now His Majesty's Loyal Opposition, what do you make of how he has approached his first, day in the House of Commons on the job as official opposition leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what you would expect. You know, we know that Mr. Poilievre spent 7 months attacking the Prime Minister and the Liberal government and really zeroing in on the affordability crisis and 40-year record inflation. And so I note that the Conservative Party and the leader put out a release today, you know, repeating familiar refrains around axing the carbon tax, opposing increasing in payroll tax premiums to the CPP and EI benefits, and even proposing a pay-as-you-go law that would require the federal government to put aside $1 in savings for every dollar spent. And so, you know, these are gimmicky releases that are put out by parties, and so I think it's what you would expect. But I find this all fascinating because I think the affordability and cost of living, yes, a component of that is no doubt, you know, 40-year record inflation, and, you know, the consumer price index we saw today, the cost of food has gone up by almost 11% in the past year. And so, yes, you know, not being able to afford food or gasoline is certainly part of affordability. But I think, you know, as a liberal, and I'm sure Kim would agree with this, you know, affordability can also be aided by government programs like dental care, which is part of the confidence and supply agreement from a few months back, and also pointing to national child care, $10 a day child care that, you know, the federal government was able to sign agreements with every single province. And so I think affordability is not just about you know, prices at the pumps or at the grocery store. While that is definitely important and Canadians are struggling, it's also about what government can do to provide national programs to help those who are really modest income and more vulnerable. And so I think what you have is two parties who largely agree, the Liberals and NDP, on how to tackle the affordability crisis, and one party, the Conservatives, that's taking quite a diametrically opposed view as to what the role of government is and what government should do.
And Kim, Janet, what do you make of how the various parties and how some of their leaders, as to how they've addressed some of the most pressing issues, specifically, you could say, on affordability, because that seemed to be the main focus of today's question period. How has that changed, do you think, since June, when Parliament left for the summer? What do you make of, I guess, how that's changed?
Just a couple of things. You know, when the House was sitting in June, I remember at one point the Speaker of the House, and Anthony Rota, stood up because, you know, it was at the end of the session. MPs were really tired, and the Speaker stood up and said, I feel like I'm at a daycare trying to corral all the children here. And again, you saw today, the first day that the House was back, Anthony Rota, the speaker, stood up again and said, we started off well, but we're back to where we were. I think we're going to see a lot of that throughout this session, a lot of combativeness on both sides. In terms of the affordability, it's trying to see which party can capture the narrative, whether or not, you know, and it's a pocketbook issue. And yes, things like gasoline, I filled up my tank today, gasoline prices are down, but groceries are way up. So who can control the narrative and really hit to people at home in terms of what they can do? Today, the government, Randy Boissonnault, the Minister of Tourism, stood up and said, you know, throughout this session, you're going to hear two narratives. You're going to hear our narrative, the government's narrative about what we can do, and then you'll hear what the Conservatives are going to be saying about, you know, what they're not doing. And I found it interesting that today as well, the NDP released their ad. It went out on social media, and it was about, here's the real Pierre Poilievre, and this is not what he's telling you. He does deals with big government, he does deals with CEOs, and he voted against the federal minimum wage. So they're all trying to twice. Yes, it was in the ad. So they're all trying to see what part of the narrative and whether or not only their base, but the others who can be on board. And what was interesting, the other thing, I'll just make one final note, Wyatt, is there were a couple of polls that came out today. They're all showing, most recently Nanos being one, that the Conservatives are slightly ahead so far. But I mean, it's just day one of the session. The polls were taken between either September 16th or between the September 16th and the 18th. So I think it's a bit early, but we'll see what happens over the coming months and what happens, whether or not there's a fall economic update and what the positioning is on all of that from all the parties.
And Kim, you mentioned in your last answer, and Andrew alluded to it too, as it relates to the supply and confidence deal between the Liberals and the NDP. How important do you foresee that being in the coming weeks and the coming months as Parliament continues really right up until the Christmas break, the winter break, as to getting things done?
Well, if things aren't getting done, then the deal is off. And that's really where we're at. And really, that should be, as much as we want to talk about this being a confidence and supply motion and this deal, it also is how Parliament is supposed to work. And if the government wants to move forward on issues that matter to Canadians, that are actually going to help Canadians, then they're there. Then the Democrats are there for it. If they're going to continue to do tax cuts for everyone in high income brackets, great. And look, I'll also say this, and Janet alluded to the Minister of Tourism a couple of times. He's also the Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance. So he wasn't like super backbenchy. So let's give Minister Boissonnault his due, but also, tourism is an incredibly important aspect of the Canadian economy. And one of the things I'll say, the government getting rid of finally this Arrive Canada app is going to be good for tourism, especially for border communities like Niagara Falls and Windsor. But ultimately, look, as long as people aren't burning down Parliament anymore, I feel like this notion that it's too raucous of a Parliament, people really need to read a history book. There's so many things that people should oppose. There should be conversations about the trajectory of Canadians and the trajectory of Parliament. But I don't get fussed about if somebody gets uppity in question period. I do get fussed when people slow down legislation unnecessarily that can help people. And look, I'm happy the childcare deal has been done. Let's get it fully implemented. Let's open up more spaces. And this is a deal that is an overnight sensation, 30 years in the making. So we're, let's not get too excited, Liberals, about finally getting it done.
And Andrew, when you look at the Prime Minister, obviously he is not in the House of Commons due to some scheduling conflicts, as Janet mentioned. He was obviously in the UK for Her Majesty's funeral, but then he is also now at the United Nations for the next few days. But what role does the Prime Minister and his cabinet play in addressing some of the affordability challenges that Canadians are currently facing? Or like Pierre Poilievre is saying, it's the Bank of Canada's fault?
Well, I mean, obviously they're in government, so they play a critical role. And I think, critics have said that they have focused too much on, from a communications point of view, at least, underlying, how childcare, for example, will help alleviate costs for everyday families. And that's certainly the case. But, building on my earlier point, affordability goes to both government support, but also prices at the pumps, prices at the grocery store, and other everyday expenses. And so I think this affordability plan that was announced by the government at the cabinet retreat in Vancouver about 10 days ago will help. And the various aspects of doubling the GST tax credit and the housing top up for renters through the Canada Housing Benefit. These supports will help everyday Canadians. And so, the Conservatives will continue to play politics around it, but I think the government is doing its best at this time. I want to make a couple of quick points that, building on what Janet said. I found it fascinating that the NDP today released that 30-second video that they decided to attack Pierre Poilievre and not the government. I think that tells us that they are very concerned that the Conservatives are going after traditional blue-collar NDP votes. We've seen this with Doug Ford's PC party in Ontario and the immense success they had in the election provincially. And so I think the NDP are very worried about Mr. Poilievre's ability to attract blue-collar votes throughout the country. And that's why they've been so proactive in putting out this video. And then finally, just in terms of the dynamic in Parliament, as you say, the Prime Minister won't be in Parliament until Thursday. I think that will be fascinating to see two, very partisan leaders face off. And also, we haven't yet seen the official opposition critic lineup. So in the coming days, Mr. Poilievre will announce. He did announce his leadership team, but we'll wait to see what his critic lineup will look like. And I'll be very interested to see what opposition critics are paired with what ministers, in terms of, it's always important you find someone that is the right opposition critic in terms of personality who can go up against that minister. And so I'll be watching for that lineup and who's paired with which
and
minister.
who's getting a promotion in that too, because that will also set the tone for the candidates that they're looking to build forward, how they're going to speak to Canadians. I'm looking to see what role does Cheryl Gallant have in the Pierre Poilievre universe.
And alternatively, which experienced members of Parliament for the Conservatives who used to be cabinet ministers like Ed Fast, Michelle Garner-Rempel, how far back in the back rows they're going to be seated.
Yeah, and how does he treat those MPs who didn't support his leadership bid? He has a 9-member leadership team. 8 of those 9 endorsed him. The 9th individual was neutral. So he didn't appoint a single MP who endorsed Mr. Charest, Mr. Brown, or the other 2 candidates. And so I don't think he can get away with that approach with an opposition critic lineup of probably 35 or 40 MPs. But I'll be interested to see what, if any of his opponents in caucus are given prominent critic roles, not associate critic of tourism, but, some of the bigger portfolios, and what's the breakdown in terms of his supporters in caucus versus those who endorsed other candidates. Because yes, he won with 68% and he won 330 ridings, but there were he only had about 62 caucus endorsements, and there are 118 caucus members. So there were many that were either neutral or backed Mr. Charest or Mr. Brown or Miss Lewis. So it will be interesting to see what roles they get in caucus.
And how many of them will have automated messages that go to their constituents if they don't stay up in line, as we saw last week with Mr. Reyes, which, look, if you're going to go org to org, I wouldn't got to go against Alen Reyes. You tend to get on the ugly side of that pretty quickly, as the Poilievre folks had to backpedal on that pretty quickly. But it was clearly meant as a warning to the caucus members. Step out of line and we're going to come at you, and it failed flat. So we'll see how he manages his proverbial carrots and sticks internally.
Okay. Interesting to note, obviously, as Andrew mentioned, out of the 9-member leadership team unveiled by Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, 8 of them did endorse him in the leadership race, the 9th one being Luc Berthold, who was the deputy leader of the party. So not necessarily being neutral because he wanted to, but having to because he was a member of the leadership team, something that the interim leader, Candace Bergen, set out that if you're going to remain a member of the leadership team, you must be neutral in the leadership race. Okay, Janet Silver, Kim Wright, and Andrew Perez, good of you all to make the time, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.